Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Mark Schneider. I'm the Senior Advisor at the Americas Program, Human Rights Initiative at the Center for Strategic International Studies. And I'm pleased to welcome you here for a conversation with Career and Foreign Service Ambassador Luis Arreaga, who's with us on his armchair, and I'm in mine. Mr. Ambassador, you've had a stellar diplomatic career, ending with very full years as ambassador to the Republic of Guatemala, your birthplace, starting in October 2017 and ending just this month. Previously, you served as ambassador in Iceland, at the U.S. mission to the UN in Geneva, at the U.S. Embassy in Madrid, and at USAID in Peru, El Salvador, and Honduras. You also helped carry out the international law and counter-drug policies of the United States as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for the Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement, and led in agency-wide foreign service recruitment. You have a PhD in economics and a master's degree in management from the University of Wisconsin. And we're going to concentrate on your experiences in Guatemala. Now, let me just say that for those who are watching, you'll have the ability to send in questions, which you can start whenever you're ready, online on our CSIS website. And after the ambassador and I get through with our conversation, we'll ask him some of the questions that you've raised. Mr. Ambassador, looking back, what are you most proud of during your 3 years as ambassador? And again, broadly speaking, what do you regret the most about those 3 years?
Well, Mark, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this event. Really grateful for that. Now, in terms of your question, I think, first of all, if the embassy achieved anything positive during my tenure there, it was because we had a fantastic team that worked together marvelously. So in that context, I would say that there's one thing that I believe we're most proud of is our work in support of the indigenous communities of Guatemala. We had two lines of effort. First, we worked to empower women, indigenous leaders. We tried to give them a platform. We heard them, and we try to include them as much as we can in our work to support their communities. The second part of our work had to do with an initiative called La Ruta. La Ruta was basically an attempt to have a respectful, and I mean that, respectful dialogue with the indigenous leaders of the Western Highlands, which is the main source of migration in Guatemala. And we wanted them to sit down with us and tell us what were their most immediate needs. And the whole idea of this dialogue was to together identify the most immediate needs and then together try to find a way to address those needs. We committed to mobilize not only US government resources, but the resources of the Guatemalan private sector and the resources of the Guatemalan government so that together we could address the most urgent needs of these communities. Now, in terms of the question as to what is it that I regret the most? I would say failing to prevent the expulsion of CICIG by the previous administration. It doesn't really take a whole lot to connect the dots between the departure of CICIG and some of the things we're seeing in Guatemala today.
Thank you. That's, in fact, what I want to focus on a little bit more. As somebody who visited you several times when you were ambassador there, followed Guatemala relatively closely over the course of the past several decades, back to the peace negotiations, conflict, and the aftermath. Let me ask you about the direction that Guatemala is currently taking. To set the stage by, in a sense, describing some of the major concerns, I think, of people inside civil society, inside Guatemala, and NGOs outside, who believe that there is a fundamental threat to the rule of law, to anti-corruption and accountability, and that threat also puts at risk democracy and the idea of inclusive economic progress, including for the indigenous. And so in that regard, what's your sense about the direction that the country is heading?
Well, it is worrisome. I think that since 2018, there has been a shift in the relationship between power and the citizenry. And that shift has not, I repeat, has not been in favor of the latter. All you have to do is compare what happened in 2015 when people were out in the streets demanding change, and change indeed took place. And some of those same voices are calling for change today, and they're being ignored. So there's definitely, these are trends that are very worrisome indeed.
Let me ask in that regard, during this time period, as you say, after the ouster of CICIG, we've also seen the threats, physical threats, against the former Fiscal General, former Attorney General, resulting in her seeking and the United States granting her political asylum. Here, we've seen threats against the justices of the Constitutional Court, and some of the judges who are handling some of the corruption cases, as well as efforts to basically get rid of the anti-impunity unit, FESI, in the department, in the Ministerio Público. Are you worried that these actions are threaten the country's ability to deal with the problems from organized crime, to deal with the problems of corrupt linkages between certain forces and those forces of organized crime?
Yes, I am. I mean, the fact is that the departure of CICIG emboldened many of the criminals who had actually been nabbed by the public ministry, by FESI, and are now awaiting trial. And there's already been a movement to try to lower their sentences, to try to find ways to get house arrest, and a number of other initiatives that appear to be directed at impunity. Just look at what is happening right now. You had a constitutional court that issued a ruling at the request of the public ministry, and that ruling ordered the Guatemalan Congress to elect both the Supreme Court and appellate court magistrates, taking into account a FESI investigation report that showed clearly major conflict of interest by some of the people who would have been favored by this election. You have candidates and you have legislators talking to an individual who is awaiting trial for corruption. And that in any country would be enough grounds to disqualify them, but not in Guatemala. And here we are many months after that order was issued, and it has not been obeyed. Now, you would have to ask the Congress as to why they have not done that. And when you look at also some of the statements by organizations and by other individuals to try to discredit the Constitutional Court, it's very worrisome, because you have people who are not necessarily supportive of criminal groups, but who are taking advantage of the current situation to put forward their own views with respect to the Constitutional Court. For instance, in the United States, we know that people may agree or disagree with the decisions of our Supreme Court, but that doesn't mean that people will take initiatives to eject the members of the court. This is happening in Guatemala, and this is happening only months before the term ends. And that gives you a sense of some of the trends that are indeed very worrisome that are taking place in Guatemala right now.
Let's go into that a little bit. Once the Constitutional Court issued that ruling and the Congress, at least the leadership of the Congress, failed to abide by it, is there any responsibility on the part of any other institution in Guatemala to enforce that ruling? Ministerio Público, to bring charges against those who failed to carry out that ruling or abide by it?
In theory, there are. And in fact, there were some actions taken by the public ministry which suggested that this action should be investigated by the committee that failed to obey that order. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court, which is the current Supreme Court, decided to deny that request, that the immunity of these individuals be lifted. Mm-hmm. So you have to ask yourself the question, why did the Supreme Court issue that ruling?
And
I'm not going to speculate, but it's certainly a good question that needs to be looked at.
Now, is there something more that can be done on the part of the United States to make clear the concern that you've expressed about these decisions?
I think I am going to let the recently arrived new U.S. ambassador to Guatemala to address that question. He is in a much better position to make those recommendations, and he's certainly qualified to do so.
As you know, in Guatemala, there's been a view that there's certain forces that have been described as los corruptos, who are behind some of these actions. Can you help us understand who they are alleged to be?
Well, of course, the most open case is the case of this individual. His name is Gustavo Alejos, who has been meeting with the individuals who are candidates to be in the Supreme Court, with congressmen or the Supreme Court, while he is in prison. So can you imagine if somebody in prison is meeting with politicians and judges? It would be a scandal. But in Guatemala, nothing has happened to address that. So it's who is corrupto? For me, the definition is simple: anyone whose personal interests are ahead of the country's interests is a corrupto, from my point of view. And that could be a politician, that could be a businessman, that could be a government employee, anyone whose personal interests are ahead of the country's interests.
There have been cases that we all know about, the La Linea customs fraud case that involved and resulted in the indictment of the then president, Otto Perez Molina, and his vice president, who actually was convicted and sentenced with respect to those crimes. Most of the individuals who were then charged were customs officials and others who were related. Were there any private sector, what we call traditional economic elite, involved in the customs fraud case?
I don't have the details of the case of La Linea. I know that there have been cases where businessmen were taken to court, so I couldn't give you an authoritative answer. But of course, there are members in the private sector who, it takes two to tango: the one who pays and the one who receives it. And you may have heard about the latest case where FESI seized about $20 million in cash. Now, that money came from somewhere. And the case is under reserve, so I don't, allegedly somebody from the previous government was involved. So we'll have to see where that goes. And obviously, if you're going to fight corruption, you have to go after the individual who pays as well as the one who receives. And of course, there is a narco money, which, that's going to be more difficult to find, but all these need to be followed.
About the narco money and the influence on the political process, about the politics in Guatemala, there have been at least two cases where the United States ultimately has arrested two leading presidential contenders in Guatemala from the last election, Mario Estrada and Manuel Valdezon, and they actually found them as having links to organized crime, to the cartels. Now, those individuals previously were thought to be businessmen or significant economic and political actors. How far-reaching is that influence on the part of those cartels?
It's quite strong. I think if any enterprising analysts would take a look at mayors along the Guatemala-Mexico border and along the border areas, and you will find a pattern that certain political parties have a stranglehold on those positions. And some of those parties have been linked to narco-trafficking. So it is growing, and I think there's a lot more happening that has not come up to the surface that needs to be looked at, where legitimate businesses and legitimate in question, quotation marks, have slowly penetrated certain procurement processes that are actually transparent, but they have managed to, through extortion, to get contracts that and what I tell many of my friends is, especially in the private sector, that they need to watch that very carefully, because they're going to be next. If you allow certain businesses to grow, they are eventually going to start competing with some of the established and honest businesses, and they're going to have to do something about it. It nearly happened in Colombia. I used to follow Colombia in my younger years, and it could happen in Guatemala as well.
Does that, let me ask you the question. Why haven't the modern parts of the business sector understood that threat exists, number one, and number two, that without an effective rule of law, it's very difficult to see international investment at a significant level coming to Guatemala, and Guatemala being able to achieve the kind of economic progress that benefits the entire country?
Well, it depends on who you talk to in the private sector. I know quite a number of entrepreneurs and businessmen who are aware of the threat and who are very concerned and are looking for ways to help the country. There are other parts of the private sector that are not as concerned. And I think it's important to hear different parts of the private sector, because there's not one voice. It is not a monolith. There are significant portions of the private sector that share this view, and probably don't speak up. I need, it would be interesting to find out why, but who are very concerned. I think this is one area where it's still vexing to me, why the private sector, the one that speaks, normally doesn't talk about these things and is worried about other issues.
There are authorities, legal authorities available to the United States when that kind of corruption exists to take actions against those individuals. Has that been done enough in the case of Guatemala?
It has. It has. Well, you mentioned the two cases you talked about. There is the Estrada case and the Valizon case. Those are U.S. attorneys involved in those particular cases. But Guatemalans shouldn't rely on the United States for that. And that's why it is so important that FESI continue to be strengthened. FESI has the tools, the personnel, and the leadership to do the job. And in fact, the most recent case of the seizure in Antigua, Guatemala of $20-some million is a case in point. This happened while FESI was under attack by criminal and corrupt networks because they're afraid of the institution because that's the institution that has actually touched their interests. And they would very much like to get rid of FESI and its leader.
Would you say the same about the Constitutional Court, current Constitutional Court, in terms of its role in trying to strengthen the rule of law?
Absolutely. The Constitutional Court, in recent history, it has played a critical role in keeping democracy from going off the rails in Guatemala. It started out back with the Serranazo. That's the case that most people know. And the fact is that they have made rulings that aren't necessarily been rulings that have been in the interest of the United States, some of the business sector rulings. But that does not mean that they're bad. Actually, like any court, they make their rulings and everybody needs to abide by them. And in that sense, the Constitutional Court has been perhaps in recent years the one institution that has been the bulwark against efforts by corrupt networks to take over the country.
And so why has it been attacked most recently by individuals who, let me put this way, who should know better?
Well, there's this narrow view in Guatemala that in some sectors that what they call certeza jurídica, judicial certainty.
Right.
It's only one person. There's only one person who is standing between the country having judicial certainty and that person happens to be in the Constitutional Court, but they happily ignore all the corruption that you see in other parts of the judicial system. So it's one of the things that I pull my hair when I think about it, because you don't have to like all of the rulings of the court, but you have to recognize that it has played an important role in preserving democracy in Guatemala, and they continue to do so.
During your time there was a period where assistance was cut, suspended.
Yeah.
In Guatemala, and that. Let me ask, what was the impact on that on your efforts and the efforts of your team to help Guatemala pursue efforts like FESI and others to strengthen those elements within that were attempting to move Guatemala in the right direction, and also deal with the indigenous problem?
Well, the suspension was relatively short, and so like any institution, we adjusted to it and tried to direct our resources in the best way we could. Fortunately, the suspension was lifted, and we are now working on the core issues that are the causes of migration. lack of economic opportunity, weak rule of law, weak institutions. So we are now going full bore, and we're very pleased that we have those resources.
There was a question that was asked from the outside observers, and I want to try and get it. The question was, what's being done to equip the next generation in Guatemala to understand and to counter corruption in Guatemala, in terms of communicating to the younger generation, in terms of bringing them, making them more aware of this issue?
I can just speak generally about some of the USAID programs that promote government transparency. And I think that's very important. And I know that some of that may include educational efforts, but I am not going to go much more than that because I don't have the details. But that's a very important question, and it is something that we need to work in teaching the culture of lawfulness from early age.
Let me ask you this. This is another question that we got from James Olson, I think Rear Admiral, U.S. Office of National Drug Control Policy. He sort of asks, I'll say, will the corruption cases against the president and vice president really make a difference in Guatemala? And how can that country's brave steps have an impact on the region? He starts it by saying that the Guatemala seemed to have made some progress. And I would agree, prior to kicking out CICIG, I think it was clear that there had been progress. And then you had the evidence that that president, vice president, apparently the following one also may well have been involved in corruption. But the question is a good one. How are those cases going to have a significant impact in Guatemala? Well,
I think the deterrence is certainly one of them. If you manage to successfully prosecute, obviously the proofs has to be there. I mean, you don't make things up. I mean, is that in fact that was one of the biggest impacts of CICIG, that it deterred people from doing things. And once it departed, that changed. But I also want to make sure to mention something, because we have to give Guatemala credit for the support they're giving and the efforts they're giving to counter narcotics. Its maritime units have been very successful in preventing the maritime trafficking of narcotics. And in fact, the Guatemalan unit is really an example, to the point that other units from other countries come and train there because they've been so good at it. So that's something that has to be recognized. And also another measure of their success is that the number of narco flights have been increasing because the sea lanes have been closed to them, at least on the Pacific side. Now, of course, we all know about the balloon effect. If you squeeze in one end, it pops up on the other, and this is what's happening. So by the time I left, I know that our law enforcement agencies were working to bolster the Guatemalan capacity to prevent flights from landing. It's not easy. There are many areas of the country that don't have much government presence, that are difficult to access, and there's a whole bunch of other issues. But Guatemala deserves credit for the work they've done with us on countering narcotics trafficking.
Well, let's take that. I mean, because if you go back and you look at what's the flow of cocaine and drugs from the Andes up through Central America and Guatemala, it's very hard to see any significant reduction. In fact, the bulk still goes through Guatemala one way or the other. They're coming overland from Honduras, coming from the as you say, maritime or air. So, I mean, how do you respond to the argument that the policy is simply not working?
Well, since about 2014, 15, there was a marked increase in the cultivation of coca plants in Colombia. Mm-hmm. And there has also been an increase in Peru and other places. So that needs a market. Right. So the sheer volume it will increase so much that they're going to try to go and I know that we have now a program in Colombia, and Colombia is working with us very closely to try to prevent that from happening. But in the meantime, those flows are going to continue to go there. And it's the counter-narcotics fight is a dynamic process that requires us to be on our toes and move as quickly and hopefully anticipate where the flows are going. But it's been a fight like that. It's been like that for a long time. And I suspect it will continue to be as long as we remain the largest market. Despite our efforts to reduce demand, we'll just need to continue the fight. I don't know that we have alternatives.
Is part of the answer in Guatemala, going back to your comment about the need to provide additional mechanisms for the inclusion of the indigenous population in the parts of the country, the Western Highlands, but basically in rural Guatemala to strengthen their ability to achieve some kind of economic progress and to have faith and trust in law enforcement and the rule of law so that they, in fact, are willing to cooperate with that in trying to prevent the arrival and the departure of drug flows through their farms and territories.
You're absolutely correct. I mean, the lack of economic opportunity, the poor governance services in these areas make it a fertile ground for easy money to come in and to co-opt. Otherwise, law-abiding citizens who are hungry and who see in this a possibility for feeding their children. Guatemalans don't like to live, don't like to come to the United States. I mean, they come because this is the only way they can actually survive. And this is why we are focusing our efforts of bringing economic opportunity to these areas, because if they have the opportunities, they will stay. But it's not easy. It's not going to be easy, and it's not going to happen overnight.
Let me ask you this, because this goes back to the issue which has been frustrating to many of us over the years. The Guatemala private sector generally has opposed increasing tax revenues to permit the government to provide services in those areas, arguing that the government is not competent. But in fact, Guatemala has probably the lowest tax revenues as a percentage of GDP in the region, and that's the way it's been. Despite the peace agreement where they said they were going to increase in 4 or 5 years to 13%, and then go above that to the Latin American average, which is about 18%. They're still down around 9%. Is there any sense that there's an awareness that these things relate to each other?
I think there is. I think there is, and there are plenty of entrepreneurs and who understand that they need to pay more, and who would probably be willing to pay more. And many of them actually put their own money on projects because this is what needs to be done. And there's plenty of that. But yes, you're absolutely right. Every major international financial institution recommends that taxes be increased, tax revenue, let's say, be increased in Guatemala. But for some reason, you have to go back to the Congress. Why doesn't the Congress pass laws? And another thing to point out is that despite the low level of investment, despite the high levels of corruption, Guatemala still manages to build a road here, a road there, maybe a couple of schools here. It's many economists are quite surprised that with all of the money that gets stolen and with such low revenue, some things still get done. Because there are people inside the government who want to do the right thing. It's not it's not everyone.
Right. I mean, but when you look broadly at the country as a whole, there's still a fundamental lack of investment in the indigenous areas, a fundamental failure to, in a sense, to ensure that they have services that are anywhere near equal to the services that the general population receives. Before we go to some of the other questions, let me turn to something which is slightly occurred since you left Guatemala, is the issuance of a report by the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, minority staff, Democratic staff, apparently reporting that a DHS force had violated its agreement with the State Department, the State Department's INL Bureau, the International Narcotics Law Enforcement, by using funds to rent vehicles and actually take Honduran migrants from the Mexican-Honduran border back to Honduras, and according to the report, without very much regard to their health, safety, or rights as refugees, possible rights as refugees under U.S. treaty obligations. Were you kept in the dark about that until after it occurred? Did you know about it ahead of time?
To the extent that there's been a request for an investigation on this alleged incident, I think it would be best for me to not comment on it.
Well, I mean, the question is, if you didn't know about it before it happened, and you don't think that that should be the way that agencies operate in a country where you or others, where you're the ambassador, what do you suggest that could be done to ensure that that doesn't happen in the future? That is, an ambassador gets blindsided by whatever the agency, whatever the rogue agency is, that takes an action like that, that apparently occurred. In fact, the State Department response to the Senate, the second response said, yes, that occurred and it shouldn't have occurred and violated our agreement with DHS. So how do you prevent that in the future?
Well, like any operation, any law enforcement, first of all, we do not conduct operations in foreign countries, in foreign soil. We train, we equip, we mentor. Now, sometimes it requires law enforcers to go out into the field, and we normally lay out rules of the game, and then we normally have coordinating meetings. So if something like that would happen, then you'd have to go back and look at what went wrong, why, and try to tweak the way you run things. Yeah.
I mean, but I mean, it seems to me that you would have to argue that no agent should be able to carry out actions that without the ambassador's knowledge, number one. Number two, that any actions that violate an agreement, an interagency agreement, need to be investigated and those responsible held accountable.
Well, again, to the extent that there's been a request for an investigation, it's best that I do not discuss my knowledge of those events.
Okay. All right. Let me go back then to other question that we've received. And I guess I'd go back to the question of when CICIG was operating in Guatemala, there were linkages between CICIG, support for CICIG from the US government, substantial, other governments, and and CICIG was helping to strengthen the capacity of the Guatemalan justice system. But it wasn't just FESI. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit more of the kinds of institutional strengthening that CICIG was carrying out at that time.
My recollection is that they also participated with Guatemalan institutions in the drafting of judicial reforms, in the drafting of legislation that would strengthen the overall justice system. And one thing that is always important to remember is that CICIG was not doing this because they thought it had to do that. And CICIG went to Guatemala because the Guatemalans asked the UN to send them there. So if there's any notion out there that this was the UN imposing its views on a country, it's wrong. It was an institution that the Guatemalans asked to come to Guatemala. So those were some of the areas. I know that they also had looked into ways to work with the universities. There were a number of other activities besides simply investigating.
Right.
And they had earned quite a good reputation. We can spend hours talking about what went right and what went wrong with CICIG because it wasn't a perfect institution. Like any institutions that is composed of human beings, there are going to be mistakes, but again, you fix them and you move on. So,
when you were there, as a result of the combination of the work of CICIG, there were specific courts that had been strengthened to deal with issues of corruption. What's your general sense about that as a mechanism for helping a country withstand the pressures of corruption?
Well, I think specialized courts make sense. When you think about some of the, for instance, through USAID, we were able to promote the idea of having the 24-hour court, which basically would make justice accessible to people 24/7, something that was needed. The high-risk courts was also one of the examples that you use, because this is where the high-risk cases would go. So as a model, it makes sense, but it has to be staffed by honest magistrates.
Mm-hmm.
And there are quite a number of honest magistrates in Guatemala. There are others that there have been questions about their rulings, but that's up to the Guatemalans to sort out. Yes.
If there, that's an important point, it seems to me, that when the U.S. decides how it's going to cooperate with Guatemalan institutions and strengthen the rule of law, if you find that, as it currently, if the new members of the Supreme Court and later the new members of the Constitutional Court are those that the Ministerio Público has found to be dirty, how should the United States react?
Well, you're asking me a hypothetical question, so I think I will just not go there. And also, it will be something that I will not be responsible for. So, let's just move on.
All right. Is there any way that something more can be done in Guatemala, from your experience in Guatemala, by civil society, by those in the private sector who recognize this issue is important to the future of the country, by political leaders in Guatemala? Is there any way to organize an effort to make this across party lines, ideological lines, to make this a fundamental national objective?
Absolutely. The missing ingredient in Guatemala is respectful dialogue. I mean, when you talk to different people, whether it's a private sector, civil society, you realize that there's not that much difference between their perspectives. But sitting them down around a table it's become very difficult. Guatemala, I think, is the victim of one of the most insidious phenomena, which is this ideological political debate of left versus right. I mean, Guatemalans get lost on ideological arguments, and in the process, they do not pay attention. They get distracted from the core issues affecting the country. You sometimes you sit down and you hear a political discourse that you might have heard back in the 1970s, in the 1980s, of communists and socialists threatening to take over the country, when in fact the biggest threat comes from criminal networks that want to take over the justice system. And in the process, they also ignore the key problems like malnutrition, poverty, all the problems that are still there and haven't gone away from time immemorial.
Let me just ask one other thing. There does seem to be a increasingly pressure as well on independent press in Guatemala. And is it your sense that it comes from the same sources that are trying to get rid of FESI and limit the capacity of the justice system to deal with corruption? Or is it another factor?
Well, you hear different things, so I hate to spread information that is not based in fact. But yes, there is pressure on independent press so that they do not publish certain things. And usually the interested parties are the ones who are putting that pressure on. They are accused of many things, but the press suffers from some of the same challenges that the press suffers worldwide. This movement into the internet, and the model is not appropriate. And many outlets in Guatemala are now trying to make that shift, so they do not have to depend so much on advertising and depend more on subscriptions by the readers. And so yes, the threat is present, but I think that they are doing a pretty good job of defending themselves. But it's a daily fight for them.
Let me ask you. Obviously, one of the other challenges facing Guatemala relates to dealing with the problem of the coronavirus, COVID-19, obviously, Guatemala's health system is not the strongest. The ability to ensure that the efforts at public health messaging and quarantines is very difficult. But during this time, the president of Guatemala expressed his concern and unhappiness that the United States had deported some Guatemalan from the U.S. who were shown to be COVID positive. When you're looking back, is there something more that the U.S. should have done to prevent this likely increasing difficulty of Guatemala handling the coronavirus?
I think no one expected the pandemic to hit, and we were all struggling to figure out what would be the best way to send returnees. These are Guatemalan citizens, and the Guatemalan government had the obligation of accepting them. It's the same way we have to accept our own citizens. So I think we learned a few lessons. We established protocols that were reasonable and we could have established them earlier, but again, this is all happening as the situation was developing, and I don't think there was any intention of sending individuals that were infected. I think we were all dealing with a difficult situation, but we learned as we went on, and we now have a system where we screen the migrants, and the Guatemalans accept the system. We discussed it, and things are moving, at least as of the time I left, are moving smoothly. But like any crisis, it's always good to go back and look at what we could have done differently, and maybe get ready for the next one. But it's part of any crisis management. You used to work for the crisis group, didn't you?
Well, in that issue, it does seem to me that until the U.S. can say that every individual that we're deporting back to Guatemala during this time of the pandemic has had a PCR test, and is every individual tested and is not positive, is negative, that you don't send anybody back. You can't make that statement that they've had a full test and they are negative. I think that my view is that's simply unacceptable. Let me ask you this: it does seem to me that we don't have very good information about what's happening in the rural areas of Guatemala in relation to the pandemic. I've seen a lot of the data that the Ministry of Public Health has had, and it seems that the same kind of lack of access to facilities in the rural indigenous area reflects a lack of information now, so that is it your sense that we still don't have a very good idea of the degree to which the pandemic has impacted in the rural area?
I would have to defer to our CDC team in Guatemala. By the way, we have an outstanding team in Guatemala, and they have been working day and night to help Guatemalans deal with the pandemic. And they go out a lot. So I would have to ask them, because I'd be just speculating if I am answering that question.
If you had to, again, let me step back. If there is one thing that you would like to see the U.S. government do in its relationship with Guatemala going forward, in terms of dealing with the major challenges, what would that be?
Well, it's clear to me that our commitment in the anti-corruption fight remains as strong as it has been. That has to continue, and is continuing. And the only reason I'm saying it has to continue because it is continuing, and of course, to the extent that migration and the poverty associated with it and the lack of opportunity associated with it remains the root causes, we need to redouble our efforts to work on that, and we are doing that. We have a fantastic USAID team on the ground, and we're working. One of the things that I think the embassy did well was the coordination between USAID and INL in ensuring that they were always coordinated, and that we approached the issue in a whole of government approach and addressed, for instance, La Ruta, this initiative that I mentioned to you, is a joint USAID INL initiative, and I think that has to be a key part of our way forward, because we were able to obtain buy-in from the indigenous leadership. It wasn't easy. We were not the first ones to come to them and say, hey, we want to talk to you because we want to help you. They've had many people who said that before, but never returned. So it took us a good almost 2 years to gain their trust, and also to include the indigenous women leaders. Now that we have that, it's time for us to roll up our sleeves and mobilizing not only our resources, but the resources from the private sector and the Guatemalan government. And I have no expectation that the Guatemalan government will not help. They intend to help us, and that is great. The way things should be done.
We're back again.
Okay.
Okay. Let me ask you this. I mean, so going forward, where the Guatemalans are showing commitment to these issues, commitment to anti-corruption, commitment to dealing with poverty and inequality, the U.S. should help. Should the U.S. make a stronger condition on Guatemalan increasing tax revenues in order to enable the government to invest more in the area of health and justice systems, education, health in the rural areas?
Well, Guatemala is a sovereign nation. They can make their own decisions. I think we offer every possible assistance that we can to help them get there. And in fact, the tax collection agency receives assistance from USAID, INL, CBP, and until recently, the Millennium Challenge Corporation. So we are doing what we can do, short of twisting their arm. We don't do that. But
strong recommendations that this is necessary. Go along with that?
Absolutely. I mean, and we would not be the only voice. As I mentioned to you, the IDB, the World Bank, everyone tells them that they cannot go on with the low tax rate that they have, low taxation rate.
That's something that I've always thought that we don't do enough of, is to make it a single message, bringing together the World Bank, the IMF, the IDB, us, the bilateral donors, the EU, and sitting down and saying, look, this is absolutely essential, period. And with that, Mr. Ambassador, I think we're coming to the end of our conversation. The internet connection seemed to tell me that as well.
Okay.
So I think we're ready to end this. Let me give you an opportunity to make any final comments.
No, so thank you so much for the opportunity, and I want to wish the Guatemalan people the best. They are a noble people that deserve nothing but the best.
Couldn't agree with you more, and thank you very much.